Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Dr. Kareem Godil. Here I'm bringing you another episode on our Better Clinician series. Today we're going to be talking about arterial blood gases. I'm going to show you all the easy three-step methods to figure out any metabolic derangement in your patient. But before we start the video, I want you all to like and subscribe to this video. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Alright, now let's get into the video. Alright, so let's talk about arterial blood gases. Arterial blood gases is how we measure metabolic derangements in the body. The first thing that we're going to want to know is normals. Once we know the normals, we'll then go into our abnormals and then go into our derangements from there. So the things that we're going to see on our ABG and other items that we're going to see in our BMP that we're going to want to know for our ABGs and to calculate things is our PaO2, our SO2, our bicarb, our CO2, our sodium, and our chloride. Normal PaO2 is around 100, our SO2 is around 100, bicarb is 24, CO2 is 40, our sodium is 140, and our chloride is 105. Now the three easy ways that we're going to be able to calculate our metabolic derangements is by first looking at the anion gap. The second thing that we're going to be looking at is going to be our Winter's formula. And then after we calculate our Winter's formula, the third thing that we're going to want to do is calculate our delta-delta. By combining these three steps, we'll be able to figure out basically any current metabolic derangement the patient has at this particular point, at this particular time, based off their current ABG studies that we have gotten. So let's move on into anion gap metabolic acidosis. Now, what is an anion gap? Anion gap is basically you have too many anions in the body. The way we calculate this is we take our sodium and we subtract our chloride and bicarb from this. Okay, now if we plug in our normals that were on the last slide, 140 minus 105 plus 24, you get around 11. Now, the normal anion gap that we are going to be seeing, that is in literature, is around 8 to 12. So any anion gap more than 12 is going to give you an anion gap metabolic acidosis. Now this anion gap metabolic acidosis has its own mnemonics that I'm sure that you all have learned about in medical school, and that's going to be mud piles. Mud piles stands for methanol, uremia, DKA, pyrazinamide, propylene glycol, isoniazid, iron tablets, lactic acidosis, ethanol, and salicylates. Next thing that we're going to be talking about is Winter's formula. Winter's formula is an important concept to understand. I recently took my internal medicine boards. This was a question on the board, so it's something that we all need to know. It's not just ICU related. Winter's formula is going to tell us, is there adequate CO2 for the given bicarb? Okay, it's a very important statement to make. In normal physiology, our bicarb is 24, so our CO2 should be 40. But if the bicarb were to change, our CO2 will not be 40 anymore. The way that we calculate Winter's formula is 1.5 times the bicarb plus 8 plus or minus 2. Now let's say that the bicarb is 12. You do 1.5 times the bicarb plus 8 plus or minus 2. So the normal CO2 that you should be getting for a bicarb of 12 is 26. So here in red we see if the CO2 is greater than 29, 29 being the plus or minus 2 from the 26, that means you have a respiratory acidosis. If that CO2 is less than 23, we're getting 23 from 26 minus 2, that means you have a respiratory alkalosis. So even though these numbers are nowhere near that level of 40, we are still able to tell that a CO2 of 30 is causing a respiratory acidosis, even though it is much less than our quote-unquote normal 40. So as we see here in the purple asterisks, 40 is not a normal CO2. That is what you get when you calculate Winter's formula for the patient's bicarb of 24. If you change the bicarb from 24 to any other number, your baseline CO2 is going to change. It's a very important concept to remember, so I really want to ingrain it in you. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is delta-delta. Delta delta is something I had no idea about in medical school. I learned about it during residency. Delta delta is kind of similar to Winter's formula, where it's a ratio, but it's different in terms of terminology. So it asks you, is there adequate bicarb for the given anion gap? So different than Winter's formula, but kind of answers a similar question. So the way that I like to approach delta delta is not by using the very big mnemonic or very big formulas that are there, but by kind of going through the inverse relationship. So if we have our anion gap of 12 and our bicarb of 24, if as the anion gap goes up to 13, 14, 15, the anion gap goes down 23, 22, 21. So let's say the person's anion gap, went up to 20. That means their anion gap went up 8. So when we take our bicarb, if we subtract 8, we get 16. Okay? So that means if our bicarb is less than 16, that means we have a concomitant non-anion gap metabolic acidosis. It's non-anion gap because you're already calculating the anion gap and you're taking that into consideration with this delta delta. If your bicarb is greater than 16, that means you have a concomitant metabolic alkalosis. You have an alkalotic process going on, okay, along with your anion gap metabolic acidosis. This is how we, in medicine, can see if there's multiple different metabolic derangements. I know this is kind of confusing, but really try to understand these core concepts. So let's go through an example of ABGs. So here we'll go with our PaO2, SO2, CO2, sodium, chloride, and bicarb, and we'll kind of give them each numbers, and then we'll go through all the steps and see what the resulting acid-base abnormality is, the metabolic derangements. So let's start with the PaO2 of 90, and SO2 of 90, bicarb of 18, a CO2 of 18, a sodium of 135, a chloride of 95, and a bicarb of 10. First thing that we're going to want to do is calculate an anion gap. So 135 minus 95 plus 10 gives us around an anion gap of 30. Okay, so based off of that alone, we know the first thing going on with this patient is that they have an anion gap metabolic acidosis. The second thing that we're going to want to talk about is Winter's formula. Now, what is Winter's formula in this patient? Again, it's 1.5 times the bicarb plus 8 plus or minus 2. If we calculate that in this patient, it's 1.5 times 10 plus 8 plus or minus 2. So in that we get around 23 plus or minus 2. This 23 plus or minus 2 is greater than our 18. So our current patient's 18 is less than this 23. Since it's less than, that means you have a respiratory alkalosis. The third thing that we're going to do is delta delta. Now, delta delta told us the relationship between bicarb and the anion gap. So we have to draw our normals 12 and 24 of our anion gap and bicarb, and our anion gap is 30. So go from 12 to 30, if we went up 18, that means we have to go down 18 on our delta delta, and we get 6. Based off our patient's bicarb of 10, and the calculated bicarb being 6, we get a concomitant metabolic alkalosis. So just in this patient, we can go over all 3 different metabolic derangements this one particular scenario has. Now, this is great to go over differentials in patients where you cannot get a proper history or proper physical in. It really gives you a lot of information. This is 3 easy steps on how to do arterial blood gases. I really hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys have listened this far, please leave a like, subscribe, give us comments on what you want me to talk about in the future. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thank you again, and have a good one.